Tonight, you are not delivering to a stranger. You will dine with the man whose life you saved.
I'd be honored.
1.38. That was the total value of Han Kyros' life when a 21-year-old delivery girl in a worn jacket handed him a plate of meatloaf at 3 a.m. 15 years later, Han is the Iron Dragon of Chicago, a man who counts bodies instead of pennies. He has spent 6 years and bought 12 delivery franchises just to find the girl who didn't let him starve. He still carries the small token of his promise, and tonight, he's placing an order she'll never forget. Han's penthouse kitchen features a view of the skyline he effectively owns. His phone pings, $12 million moved. Politician secured. He feels absolutely nothing. He walks to a climate-controlled safe and pulls out a scrap of paper with blue ink that has outlasted his enemies. I will repay this. He touches it like a prayer bead. Where is she? The answer is closer than he knows. She's currently 5 miles away, wiping rain off a delivery bag, drowning in debt, and wondering how she'll pay for her daughter's school supplies. The Chicago rain didn't just fall, it punished. It was the kind of October cold that soaked through Han's oversized, thrift store hoodie until the fabric felt like lead against his ribs. At 17, Han Kyros was a ghost in a city of millions, a boy who had learned to breathe quietly so the world wouldn't notice he was taking up space. He sat in the furthest corner of the late-night diner, his wet hair clinging to a forehead pale from exhaustion. On the laminate tabletop, he began the nightly ritual of survival, counting pennies. 1 cent. 5. 10. His fingers trembled, partly from the chill and partly from the hollow ache in his stomach that had transitioned from a sharp pain to a dull, rhythmic throb. He reached 138. It was a number that meant nothing to the bustling city outside, but to Han, it was a verdict. It wasn't enough for a sandwich. It wasn't even enough for toast. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of wind brought the scent of wet asphalt and industrial exhaust into the warm, grease-heavy air of the diner. Nyelle Carter walked in, shaking a damp delivery jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot that spoke of a long shift. She was 21, drowning in her own sea of student debt and late-shift fatigue, yet when her eyes landed on the boy in the corner, she didn't see a loiterer. She saw a mirror. She walked over, her posture gentle but deliberate. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice a steady anchor in the buzzing fluorescent silence. Han didn't look up immediately. He was too busy trying to shield the pile of coins with his hand, a futile gesture of pride. "Food," he rasped, his accent thick and jagged. "Cheap food." "How much?" He gestured weakly at the 138 cents. Nyelle looked at the pennies, then at the boy whose eyes held a haunted, ancient weight. She knew the math of hunger. She knew that if she took those coins, he wouldn't eat again for days. Without a word, she walked to the register and rang up an employee meal, a $0 transaction that felt like $1 million heist. Minutes later, she returned, setting down a heavy plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and steaming green beans. Han stared at the food as if it were a beautiful, dangerous hallucination. I know have enough, he whispered, panic flickering in his glassy eyes. "It's on the house," Nyelle said, offering a soft, knowing smile that carried no pity, only empathy. "Eat, Han. You'll need your strength for the walk back." As he picked up the fork with shaking hands, Nyelle pushed his 138 pennies back toward him. In that moment, the plate of food became more than a meal, it was a promise. Han looked at her, memorizing the kindness in her face, a face he vowed never to forget. The meatloaf was gone, leaving only smears of gravy on the white ceramic plate, but the warmth it provided was more than physical. It was the first time in months Han had felt like a human being rather than a problem to be solved. He sat in the quiet hum of the diner, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a low-frequency heartbeat. Across the counter, Nyelle was busy with a stack of napkins, her movements rhythmic and weary, yet she stayed close enough to let him know he wasn't being rushed back into the storm. Han reached into the pocket of his soaked hoodie, his fingers brushing past the cold, damp lining until they found what he was looking for. It wasn't much, just a small, heavy coin from his home country, a piece of silver he had carried across an ocean as a reminder of who he used to be. It was the last thing he owned that hadn't been bartered for a bus ticket or a night under a roof. With hands that had finally stopped shaking, he reached for a paper napkin. He didn't have a pen, so he used the charred tip of a discarded matchstick he'd found on the floor to scrawl 4 jagged characters in Korean, Babgab Skapa. "I will repay this meal." He placed the silver coin on top of the napkin, centering it carefully so the wind from the door wouldn't claim it. He stood up, the weight of his wet clothes feeling lighter for the first time. Nyelle looked up, her soft, empathetic smile returning as she noticed him preparing to leave. "You going to be okay out there?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Han couldn't find the English words to explain that her kindness had just given him a reason to survive the winter. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for one heartbeat longer than necessary, memorizing the shape of her eyes and the way the light caught the worn edges of her delivery jacket. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice cracking with a mix of exhaustion and a new, sharp resolve. He turned and pushed through the heavy glass door, disappearing into the gray curtain of the Chicago rain. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The promise was already etched into his mind as clearly as it was on that grease-stained napkin. As Nyelle walked over to clear the table, she found the silver coin and the strange, dark symbols, unaware that she was holding the first stone in the foundation of an empire. Under the cold city lights, a boy was gone, and a king was beginning to rise. The transformation of the starving boy didn't happen in a throne room, it happened in the damp, oil-slicked darkness of the Chicago shipping docks. For Han Kyros, survival was no longer about counting pennies, it was about counting seconds between breaths while lifting crates that felt like they were filled with lead. He worked the shifts no one else wanted, the ones where the wind off Lake Michigan felt like a razor against the skin. He stayed invisible, watching the way power moved through the city like a slow-moving current, learning that in the underworld, information was as valuable as blood. By 20, the quiet steadiness he had seen in Nyelle became his own armor, though tempered by a much darker flame. He met the men who traded in shadows, smugglers and fixers who recognized that ancient, haunted look in his eyes as a sign of a man who had nothing left to lose. He made his first kill at 22, a cold, clinical necessity that silenced the boy in the oversized hoodie forever. He didn't enjoy the violence, but he mastered it, realizing that the only way to protect a promise was to own the ground it was made on. The first million came at 24, not through luck, but through a systematic dismantling of his rivals' shipping lanes. He became a ghost in a $15,000 suit, a man who spoke so softly that people had to lean in to hear their own ruin. He was no longer Han, he was the Iron Dragon, the silent king of the Seven Dragons Syndicate. He acquired port access, real estate, and politicians, building a fortress of influence that stretched across the skyline. Yet, despite the heated marble floors and the $12 million digital transfers that now defined his Tuesdays, his penthouse felt like a tomb. He owned 17 properties but lived in none of them, spending his nights staring at the gray expanse of the lake. The power hadn't erased the hunger, it had only redirected it. Every morning, before the city woke to fear him, he would unlock a private drawer and touch the silver coin and the fading napkin scrawled with charcoal. He had outlasted empires to become the most dangerous man in Chicago, but in the silence of his own mind, he was still just a boy in the rain, searching for the only person who had ever seen him as human. To the board of directors, the acquisition of Quick Drop Logistics was a strategic move to monopolize the last-mile delivery sector in the Midwest. To the city's financial analysts, it was the Iron Dragon flexing his economic muscle. But to Han Kyros, the $85 million merger was nothing more than a finer weave in a massive net. He didn't want the trucks, the warehouses, or the tax breaks, he wanted the data. He wanted the names of the thousands of women who had worn a delivery jacket in this city over the last 15 years. Han sat in his glass-walled office, the blue glow of 3 monitors illuminating his sharp, stoic features. Below him, the Chicago streets were a grid of moving lights, each one a potential lead. He had spent the last 6 years systematically buying every delivery franchise, courier service, and independent logistics firm within 50 miles. He had built a digital panopticon designed for a single purpose, to find a woman who likely didn't even know she was being hunted by a ghost. "Run the filters again," Han said, his voice a low vibration that commanded the room. His lead analyst, a man who had seen Han order the ruin of entire companies without blinking, hesitated. "Sir, we've cross-referenced Nyelle with every payroll record from 2008 to the present. We have 12,000 matches. If we narrow it by age and physical description." "Narrow it by the smile," Han interrupted, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. The analyst went silent. There was no algorithm for empathy, no data point for the way a person's eyes softened when they looked at a starving boy. Han stood up and walked to the window. He was a man who moved millions with a keystroke, yet he felt a profound, aching impotence. He had the power to stop the city's heart, but he couldn't find the one person who had taught him why it should beat. He thought of the delivery routes he now owned, the thousands of miles of asphalt he had bought just to find one specific doorstep. "She's a worker," Han murmured, more to himself than his staff. "She doesn't waste energy on vanity. She's practical. Look for the ones who have worked double shifts for a decade. Look for the ones who have never missed a delivery, even in the snow. Look for the moral anchors." He knew she was out there, likely still carrying the weight of a world that didn't deserve her. He was the Iron Dragon, but as he stared at the rain, he felt like that 17-year-old boy again, waiting for the only person who had ever offered him a plate of food without asking for his soul in return. The search continued, one payroll record at a time, until the net finally caught a glint of silver. The algorithm finally faltered where the human heart began. It wasn't a high-end logistics report that found her, but a flagged delivery notification from a small, struggling local kitchen in a neighborhood the city had tried to forget. Nyelle Carter had placed an order for a single meal, the cheapest item on the menu, at 2:47 a.m. Han didn't send his security detail. He didn't send a courier. He traded his $15,000 suit for a dark, nondescript jacket and climbed into the driver's seat of a plain sedan. He drove through the rain, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a tension no multi-million-dollar merger had ever elicited. He was no longer the Iron Dragon, he was a boy delivering a debt. The apartment building was a relic of red brick and peeling paint, the kind of place where the hallway lights flickered like dying stars. Han stood before door 4B, the insulated food bag heavy in his hand. He took a breath, the air tasting of damp concrete and old memories, and knocked. When the door opened, the world seemed to tilt. Nyelle looked older, her dark hair still pulled back in that same practical knot, but the years of working double shifts were etched into the faint lines around her eyes. She wore a simple, faded sweatshirt, and the quiet steadiness he remembered was now a shield of weary resilience. She looked at him, not at the King of Chicago, but at a delivery man. "Sorry I'm late," she said, reaching for her purse with a practiced, tired motion. "I know it's a long drive in this weather. How much do I owe you?" Han stood frozen. Up close, the moral anchor was even more real than in his dreams. Her face carried that same soft, knowing quality, the kind that suggested she had seen hunger before and hadn't let it harden her. He looked at her hands, the hands that had once pushed 138 pennies back toward him, and he felt the immense, crushing weight of his own criminal empire. "It's already paid for," Han rasped, his voice sounding like gravel under a boot. Nyelle paused, her brow furrowing in confusion. I don't think so. I didn't see a confirmation on the app. It's on the house, he whispered, the words a direct echo from 15 years ago. Nyelle stopped. She looked at him then, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, the flickering hallway light caught the sharp intelligence behind his eyes, the ghost of the starving boy she had saved. She didn't recognize him yet, but she felt the gravity of his presence, a powerful contrast to the small, quiet room behind her. "Do I know you?" she asked softly. Han handed her the bag, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. "You knew a boy once," he said, "who had nothing but a promise." The door to apartment 4B remained ajar, the warm, savory scent of the delivery meal lingering in the drafty hallway. Nyelle stood with the bag in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs with a sudden, inexplicable rhythm. She watched the man walk toward the flickering hallway light. He didn't move like a courier, there was a predatory grace in his step, a weight to his presence that made the air in the cramped corridor feel heavy. "Wait," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, his back to her. The cheap jacket he wore couldn't hide the rigid set of his shoulders or the way he held himself, like a man accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. When he turned his head slightly, the light caught his profile, and for a fleeting second, the shadow of a soaked hoodie seemed to flicker over his form. Nyelle set the bag on a small side table and stepped into the hallway. "A boy with a promise," she repeated, her mind racing back through 15 years of rain, student loans, and late shifts. She looked at his eyes, red-rimmed and glassy in her memory, but now sharp, piercing, and carrying an intelligence that had clearly survived 1,000 battles she couldn't imagine. "The coins," she murmured, her breath catching. 138 pennies. Han turned fully to face her. He reached into his inner pocket, not pulling out a weapon, but a small, worn wooden box. He opened it to reveal a silver coin and a disintegrating paper napkin. Even from a distance, she could see the dark, jagged charcoal marks. The symbols for a debt that had never been forgotten. Nyelle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. The thin, underfed teenager who had cried silently over meatloaf hadn't vanished into the city's concrete maw, he had grown into this mountain of a man. But as she looked past the expensive watch glinting under his sleeve and the cold authority of his expression, she saw the fragility she had encountered all those years ago. "Han," she breathed, the name feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. "I told you I would repay it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic vibration. He took a step closer, and for the first time in a decade, the Iron Dragon allowed the mask to slip. His eyes, usually focused on counting losses and securing politicians, were now focused entirely on her. He looked at her worn sweatshirt and the fatigue in her posture with a look of such profound, sacred gratitude that Nyelle felt the years of her own struggle momentarily lift. "You've been looking for me," she realized, the magnitude of his search beginning to dawn on her. "All this time?" "I bought the city to find the light," Han replied, his gaze unwavering. "And I never forgot your face." The moment of recognition was shattered by the screech of tires on wet pavement 3 floors below. Han's head snapped toward the window, the vulnerable man disappearing instantly behind the cold, calculating eyes of the Iron Dragon. He had been followed. In his obsession to close the circle, he had led the rot of his world to her doorstep. "Get back," Han commanded, his voice no longer a whisper but a low, jagged blade. Before Nyelle could ask why, the hallway window at the end of the corridor exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds as 2 men in dark tactical gear swung through the frame, suppressed submachine guns raised. They were from the Kangpai, a rival faction that had been waiting for the dragon to show a throat they could slit. Nyelle screamed as Han lunged, his movements a blur of violent precision. He didn't reach for a gun, he became the weapon. He intercepted the first man mid-air, a sickening crack echoing through the narrow hall as he shattered the attacker's collarbone with a single strike. The second gunman fired, the muffled thwip-thwip of bullets chewing into the floral wallpaper where Nyelle had stood seconds before. Han didn't flinch. He used the first man's body as a shield, closing the distance with a terrifying, silent ferocity. He was a monster who had counted bodies to ensure his survival, and now he unleashed that darkness to ensure hers. He disarmed the second man with a wrist-snapping twist, driving him into the brick wall with enough force to leave a crater. The hallway fell into a ringing silence, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the fallen men and the distant wail of sirens. Han stood over the wreckage, his knuckles split and bleeding, his $15,000 suit jacket torn. He turned to look at Nyelle. She was pressed against her doorframe, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and a new, chilling realization. She wasn't looking at the boy who needed a meal anymore. She was looking at the man who had built an empire on graves. The moral anchor had seen the storm, and for the first time, she looked afraid of the person she had saved. "Is this who you are?" she whispered, the words cutting deeper than any bullet. Han looked at his bloodied hands, then at the silver coin lying forgotten on the carpet. The weight of his $40 million legacy felt like a shroud. He had protected her life, but in doing so, he had revealed the monster he had become to the only person who remembered him as a human. The dragon's shadow had finally swallowed the light. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the gunfire had been. Han stood in the center of the narrow hallway, the predatory tension slowly draining from his frame, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly, devastatingly exhausted. He didn't look at the men groaning on the floor, he looked only at Nyelle. She was still pressed against the doorframe, her chest heaving, her eyes darting from the blood on his knuckles to the cold, dead efficiency in his gaze. "They won't come back," Han said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I will move you tonight. A penthouse with security, a life where you never have to count pennies or fear the dark again. I have $40 million, Nyelle. It's all yours." Nyelle didn't move toward him. She looked at the luxury he was offering as if it were a different kind of cage. "You think this is what I wanted?" she asked, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I didn't feed a boy so he could grow up to be a god of war. I didn't save a life just so it could be used to end others." She stepped over a shard of broken glass, her gaze locking onto his with the same moral clarity she had shown 15 years ago in the rain. "You say you stayed alive for me. You say you built an empire to find me. But look at what you brought to my door, Han. You brought death. You brought the very thing I tried to protect you from." Han reached out a hand, then pulled it back, sensing the invisible wall between them. "I did what I had to do to survive. To find you." "Then you missed the point," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She placed a hand over her stomach, a subtle gesture that made Han's heart stop. "I'm tired, Han. I've spent my life working for a peace that doesn't require a gun. I won't raise a child in the shadow of the Iron Dragon." She took a breath, her posture grounded and quietly strong. "If you want to be in this life, if you want to be the man I thought I saw in that diner, then the dragon has to die. No more shipping confirmed. No more politicians secured. You dismantle it. All of it. You walk away from the blood, or you walk away from me." Han looked at her, then out at the city he owned in every way that mattered. The weight of his crown felt like lead. For the first time, the $40 million empire felt like the 138 pennies, completely and utterly insufficient. He looked back at the woman who was his only anchor. "The cost is everything I built," Han murmured. "No," Nyelle replied softly, reaching out to touch his split lip with a tenderness that hurt more than the fight. "The cost is finally becoming the man you were meant to be." 5 years later, the Chicago rain still fell, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It was a cleansing rhythm that washed over the glass and brick of the Han Kyros Community Center, a sanctuary built on the ruins of an empire. Han stood by the wide floor-to-ceiling windows of the refurbished warehouse, his hands tucked into the pockets of a simple wool cardigan. There were no digital transfers lighting up his phone, no politicians in his pocket, and no blood on his knuckles. The Iron Dragon was a ghost, buried under $40 million worth of textbooks, hot meals, and second chances. Nyelle walked up beside him, her presence still the grounded, quiet strength that had saved him twice. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the courtyard below. "You're thinking about the pennies again, aren't you?" she whispered. Han smiled, a genuine, soft expression that reached his eyes that were no longer haunted, but at peace. "I'm thinking about the math," he admitted. "How one plate of meatloaf can somehow equal 1,000 lives changed. It's the only investment I've ever made that actually paid out." In the courtyard, their 4-year-old daughter, Maya, was wearing a miniature version of the yellow delivery jacket Nyelle used to wear. She was crouching by the wrought iron fence that separated the center from the alleyway. On the other side of the bars stood a boy, perhaps 14, his hoodie soaked through and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He looked exactly the way Han had looked 15 years ago, calculating survival, counting losses, and waiting for the world to strike. Without being prompted, Maya reached into her small insulated bag and pulled out a wrapped sandwich and a carton of juice. She offered it through the fence with both hands, her posture gentle and deliberate. She didn't offer pity, she offered a turning point. The boy hesitated, his eyes glassy and overwhelmed, before his shaking hands reached out to take the gift. "She has your smile," Han murmured, his voice thick with a quiet, sacred gratitude. "She has your heart," Nyelle corrected softly. They watched as the boy took a bite, his posture beginning to straighten, the first spark of hope blooming in the middle of a storm. The cycle hadn't just been broken, it had been transformed into something beautiful. The debt was finally paid, not in silver or millions, but in the simple, echoing act of a child feeding a stranger. As the twilight turned the Chicago sky to purple and gold, Han Kyros finally stepped away from the window, leaving the shadows of the past behind to walk toward the light of the dinner table. Thank you for staying with Han and Nyelle until the very end. Their journey reminds us that no act of kindness is ever truly lost, it just waits for the right heart to grow in. If this story moved you, if you believe that a single human decision can ripple across decades and reshape a destiny, then please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community here dedicated to stories that matter, stories about the quiet strength of the soul, love that demands transformation, and the promises we keep when the world expects us to forget. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your path? Or perhaps you were the one who offered it. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We read every single one. Don't forget to check out our other stories on the screen right now. You might just find the one that speaks to exactly where you are today. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.